Welcome to Old Path in our study through the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. We will be in chapter 10 today, and it follows on with what we read, obviously, in chapter 9. This is really a direct continuation in the thought that's going on. What we studied in chapter 9 was a recounting, if you will, of the history of the children of Israel, and kind of beginning at Abraham and then all the way up to their current times. If you look at it, it'll help us in our setup for this. In case you didn't get a chance to watch it last couple of weeks, because we split chapter 9 into two parts, but it's always helpful, I believe, when we can look back in kind of a historic way, looking back at either the condition of the church, the condition of a nation's history. In this case, what you have is the nation's history, that of the children of Israel from Abraham onward, and then the lack of fidelity, I guess you can say, that they had to the covenant that God had given to them. They recognize it, they see it. And this is them kind of looking back historically at the things that had taken place. And they realized this was the cause of all of their trouble at the time, their distress. What has, I guess you could say, kind of compounded that Nehemiah sees, and as does Ezra, when they got there to the land, they had seen that there was already neglect taking place. So soon after being returned to the land that they were cast out of by God for a time, they're repeating many of the same things that created the problems for them in the first place. So being able to recognize that historically, if you will, and then acknowledging those things and then recognizing that that needs to end and seeking that God would forgive them for what they have done, and then putting in place what is necessary to see that it doesn't happen again. The problem is oaths that are taken and people committing themselves to doing something, it is always going to be contingent upon whether or not they will fulfill their vow, and whether or not they are going to do as they said. And then that's the first problem with it. Second problem, what about the next generation? Will they do it as well? So this is an age-old problem. It is the problem with humanity. Why it looks so different here is that this is the nation of Israel, and these are the people that God had chosen to show himself to the world in the way that he did. Of course, we know that throughout history, man knew that he was there. Man knew what he was responsible to him to keep. We think of everything from Adam onward, but by the time that you get around to Abraham and the covenant that was made with him, it would be for a people, and it would be for those people who would occupy a particular land. So this covenant that he makes with Abraham, is about the place where they would live and who his descendants would be and what that would entitle them to have. And it is something that still matters to this day, though much of the church doesn't want to believe that. Certainly the world doesn't. But with all of that being said, they are here at a time when what has given way from the children of Israel, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then in their time of their captivity, by the time that they are working their way into the land to occupy it for the first time through what should have been the time of Moses, God gives them the law in that time in the wilderness and said, when you come into the land, here's what is expected of you. We all know that Moses never made it in, though all of the instructions for what they were supposed to do when they arrived in the land is already put in place, and it had been for a long time. Joshua is the person who actually ultimately leads them in, and even in that, all of what they were expected to do only lasted for a while. And even Joshua had made some mistakes of not really driving out all of the inhabitants of the land. And the problem with that is the corruption that comes in by the intermingling. And we see that that is a problem even now. It's one of the major reasons that there is a problem that is occurring as we're reading this particular part in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah's time, the interaction that they had with the surrounding people that were not Jewish, that did not live according to the law, it really created a corrupting influence. So just think about in the displacement of the children of Israel, beginning up in the north, when Israel was wiped out, the upper tribes, the northern tribes, when they were taken out by the Assyrians, that leaves a void, and in comes all those same people that should have been displaced long before that. And to whatever extent they were, they flood back in. Now, the lower tribes, the Judah and Benjamin in particular, and then whoever would have been in that territory from the other tribes, they're then cast out as well by the Babylonians. And so this is them coming back into the land. But from the time that the Babylonians drove them out until they're able, after those 70 years, to start with Zerubbabel in 100 years plus, or somewhere thereabouts, by the time that we're reading this, Ezra, then Nehemiah have come in, and now they are, a long time after Zerubbabel, still having the problem with things not being back the way that they're supposed to be. And there is this flood that has come back in of all of the surrounding people that they're now having that interaction with. And so if you've been studying through this with us, through Ezra and now in here to Nehemiah, you'll see that that is a major, major theme of the corruption that had come into the children of Israel because of the outside influences of the foreign nations that God wanted nothing to have, that he wanted them to have nothing to do with not only living in the nation, but for his people to interact with them. They should have been driven out from the days of Joshua. And so here we are. Now, with all of this being said, chapter 9, especially the second half of it, is them owning up and recognizing what they had done. And it was obvious. It's not like they came to some kind of conclusion that wasn't obvious. Everybody would have been able to look around at the condition of things and known that there was a real problem. So with all of that being the kind of the background of this, now there is that, I guess you could almost call it the rubber meets the road. Now what? What do we do about this? And of course, for Nehemiah, it is kind of one of those Joshua moments where he says, "As for me and my house." And it's going to be a similar thing for the upper leadership, the notable people at the top of the top. These are all people who are going to have to take a stand, which is what Nehemiah requires them to do. We're going to have to read a little bit into chapter 9 to see it. Actually, it's the last verse of chapter 9, and it'll help us where you'll see the continuation into chapter 10. There's really no break in it. So with that being said, what we have in this particular part of their history is, after the recounting, there has to then be a reckoning and saying, so what do we do going forward? What is the next thing for us to do? And you're going to find that it's after taking the pledges that they do and committing themselves to these things. And I have no reason to believe that the people who did this at the time were absolutely sincere. We just know that the problem is it's the generations that come after, or maybe some of these original oath takers didn't really fulfill what they were supposed to do. Maybe they felt in their own minds pressured to do this but had no intention of doing it. Or maybe their intentions were really solid at the beginning, but complacency finds its way in. Does that sound familiar? Happens in the church all the time. So it's a human problem as much as it is anything else. Now, with all of that said, some of the things that they implement right at the very beginning are things that are going back to a keeping specifically of the law. Not just loosely, but I mean dialed in just as the law prescribed for them to do. They were going to do those things, and in a couple of cases even more so rigidly. And we'll get into that when we get there. But it's really important for us to remember once again, and I want to take a moment to look at a passage in the book of Galatians before we get there. What we see in the Old Testament has I guess you could say, a practical reason for occurring the way that it does in their time. But they couldn't possibly have understood how much it would mean on the other side, looking back historically at what Jesus had done and of what his sacrifice was, and when did it take place, and how did it fulfill in perfection those things that were in the law. So I'm thinking primarily with like the types of offerings that would be made. So if there are offerings and there are all these other things that are put in place that are part of the law that they are supposed to do, then they might do them dutifully. But I mean, at some point, if you're a person who's having to offer sacrifices of animals and all the rest, does it finally come to a point at some place where you just go, when will this be over? When will this be made right? Because clearly the law was not able to deal with the matter of sin permanently. That's why you had to offer offerings again and again and again and again, and it could never fix the problem. And so I suppose somebody who might be thinking about that would have to know that somewhere down the road, God's going to have to do something differently, because there's just nothing that will fulfill and take away this problem of sin in a permanent sense. So with that understanding, with that kind of a mindset, if you think about this, then you start to look at the person of Jesus and say, when you consider what he did, every requirement that the law had put there that was temporary because mankind was a failure at these things, Jesus could fulfill them perfectly. And then he could offer himself, or be offered to God as this sacrifice for the sin of mankind, which is precisely what the scripture teaches. But even the way that things needed to be done, sometimes you would have to look at that and scratch your head and say, I understand the principle of why we have to do this, but why that way? Why does it have to be like that? And why on that day and all the rest of it? What does it mean? There's got to be there's a message here that really only we, as we're able to look back historically, can go, makes perfect sense, because put Jesus into that question and it all makes sense. And I'll point those out as we get to some of them here. So with that being said, before we get to Nehemiah, let's take a look at Galatians. Let's turn there. And I want to look at one particular passage that we're probably all familiar with. So let's turn then to chapter 4. Galatians 4. Almost there. All right. I'm sorry, I said 4. I mean chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. I'm sorry, I've got something in my eye. All right. So chapter 4 says, chapter 3 in verse 19 says, so what purpose then does the law serve? Great question. Well, it was added because of transgressions. It was put there because of sin. So it was added for transgressions until what? Until the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. Now, a mediator does not mediate for one only, but God is one. So he asks this question, is the law then against the promises of God? Certainly not. For if there had been a law given that could take away, that could have given life, then truly righteousness would have been by the law. And a little side note to that, we have people that will tell us that in order for us to be saved, there are some elements that we need to do of our conduct. We have to earn, or there are works that must be performed by us in order to be saved. And different churches will say you have to have this or you have to do that in order to be saved. And so there's a problem with that. And if you point out a passage like, well, the Bible talks about it's not by works of righteousness that we've done, but it's according to his mercy that he has saved us. And passages like that, or what we get for by grace you've been saved in Ephesians 2, it's not of works lest any man should boast. Usually the reply to that was, well, that's Old Testament works that are being spoken of. This is a New Testament thing that we're talking about, things that we need to do in the New Covenant, and you're pointing out elements of the Old. Paul completely obliterates that idea right here where he says this, but the Scripture has confined all under sin, that in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. I'm sorry, I'm going to read verse 21 and 22 together because I split it up. Is the law against the promises of God? So specifically he's talking about, yes, the acts, the things that were done of the law. So he says this, are they against the promises of God? It says, of course not. Because if there had been a law that could have given life, then truly righteousness would have been by the law. Consider Paul writes this as part of the church. And he says, if there was a way that you could earn your way to heaven by your works or contribute to your salvation by works, the best option would be to do things according to the law, frankly, because it's the only law that God has ever given that defines what those works are. So everything that a church would say, well, you have to do this, they're either going by their own church tradition or some tortured rendering of a particular passage, and I think usually of baptism among the biggest of the offenses in this. But somehow that baptism saves a person, or that it has to be in place in order for the person to be saved, is just silliness. Should be done, no reason why not, but the idea that you make it a salvation issue is just not, it's not supported in Scripture. And so right here, again, Paul says, look, if there was something that you could do to contribute to your salvation, it would be the law. Why? Because it's the only one that God ever gave. And he wrote it down specifically. But look at what he says. But before faith came, And that's what we operate under, because we don't operate according to the law. So Paul making the argument, now that the church has come, then here's how he says it. But before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith which would be afterward revealed. Therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. What was the purpose of all of this? Why did they have to go through all of these things? It was to tell you that you could not trust in your own efforts. It had to bring you to the person in whom you could have faith to be saved. That's the law. That's what the law did. It was a schoolmaster. It was a teacher. It was a tutor. And it would bring us to the point where it would say, you need Jesus. So I kind of put it this way. If you were to be able to have a conversation with the law, and let's say that you're there at one of those times of the feasts and you're having to make the offerings and all that stuff, and sin has come in, and some beautiful, innocent animal is going to have to pay the price for your guilt of sin, you're going to get to the point at some point where it's say, when will this all be over? And you could ask of the law, what are we going to do to fix the problem of sin forever? The law would be able to say, I can't answer that question. All that I can do is show you your offense and give you a temporary remedy. Go and make sacrifice. But it would lead us to the point where we would ask that same question now that Jesus has come into the picture, and what the law would say, go talk to him. He's the one who can do something permanently about the issue of sin, because Jesus is this perfect sacrifice offered by God on behalf of mankind, and he takes away the sin of the world, as John the Baptist said of him. So, really, really important stuff here. And we're going to get into what they do in their implementing of getting back to the way that things should be. So let's turn to Nehemiah 10 and let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much for our time in your word. We thank you for what you show us and what you help us to understand, why the importance of these things is something that we should pay attention to and be careful of. We ask, Lord, that you would give us understanding in your word, that you would bless this time as we spend seeking you out, God, that you would open our eyes to these important matters, looking at their history, but then seeing the application of this. We ask, Lord, that you would bless the time that we have spent with you, and that you would glorify yourself in the teaching of your word. In Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 10 begins this. Now, those who place their seal on the document. So what's the document? Well, let's look back to the verse right before it. Now, remember, if you haven't already done so, go back and you can either read it yourself, chapter 9, or go back and watch the last two studies, because it really was a great deal of places where they cited the things that they had done, and you can go back and look at them historically. What were those events when it's obvious which ones they are? And I went through each of those that we would know for sure what the reference is. Some of it is just so common that they would do these things with such regularity, it would be hard to kind of piece together one particular incident. But some of them were very, very clearly historical references that they had made without going into great citation. But you would know pretty much by the description of what event they're describing at the time. So with that being said, look at verse 39. Now, because of all of this, all of what? Everything in chapter 9, all of their offenses, yet God was faithful. In fact, there is this really cool, look at verse 33. This is a great summation of this, and I pointed it out last week because I think it's so important. It says, of all of our offenses, however, it says, you are just in all that has befallen us. So every bit of calamity that has ever fallen upon the children of Israel was earned. God was faithful. He kept his end of what was supposed to be, where God would say, if you do this, I will do this. So think about the dedication of the temple as a great starting point for this, because again, that's when the law was really it really hit its full stride, I would say, when there was a permanent temple, and Jerusalem then was the place of corporate worship. Remember, that was it was hundreds of years after Joshua first came into the land, but nonetheless, when you have a functioning temple in the place of Jerusalem, it's a game changer, because that's where everybody would come to for all of the feasts and all of the things that were done according to the law. So with that being said, you are just in all that has befallen us. So the things that had befallen them is exactly what God said would happen. 2 Chronicles 6 and 7 is the place you can go to check that out if you're interested. He says this, and here's why. You're just. Why are you just? Because you have dealt faithfully, but we have done wickedly. And they don't have to look at one incident. They can take that and say, for hundreds of years, this has been true. Now, before we look back at them and just go, how could you do the things that you do? How could you be so stuck in your folly? Let's remember the church has 2,000 years of history. And trust me when I say, every one of us understands this, probably not only from the personal level, but if you've done any study of the church in its history or even modern church, just realize that God has done faithfully in everything that he ever promised to the church, but the church has done wickedly, from the individual to the organization. And that's an easy case to be made. Anyhow, with all that being said, you can read the rest of it. It goes down. But then at verse 38, again of chapter 9, we read this. And because of all of this, we make a sure covenant and we write it out. Now, the sure covenant, we think when we see the word covenant, we're thinking it's something like what has been made as far as the covenants before, some written out law type of thing, like the covenant that God made with Moses, or the covenant where God said to Noah or to mankind, I will never judge by water again. Those are covenants. The covenant that Jesus made in his blood in the New Testament is a covenant. The word here in English is used, covenant, and it's only used twice, both times here in Nehemiah. I believe the other one is in the next chapter. But it's more of just saying this would be a proclamation. It would be something that they would sign their names to it or be in agreement with it. So some would speculate it really is just nothing more than stamping, if this was written out, what we see in chapter 9, that it would be just that, and they would say, I agree with everything in the content of that, and I will be a signatory to saying that we will not do the things that we have done before. It's just along those lines. It's not like that God made them, held them to a covenant. It is a covenant that God, in times past, God would make with man. I will do this. So the covenant to Abraham, I will be to you I'm going to make a deal with you, or I'm going to make an offer to you. I'm going to take you to a land that you don't know. I'm going to give you a land, and I'm going to give you descendants. And I'm going to do this, and that was a covenant that he had made with Abraham. The covenant that was made with the children of Israel through the law in Moses. Again, it's a covenant. So it was God initiated. Here, it's a man-initiated thing where they're saying, given all of what we've just discussed, here is what we pledged to do. And that pledge was between them, and that they would do this, and it was a way of saying to God, this is our pledge to you. So it's a man's way of trying to do in the imperfect, I guess you could say, what God has done in the perfect, because he was always able to fulfill what he promised. In this case, we see it won't take long till this is broken by the people. So he says this, our leaders, our Levites, and our priests seal it. So that's the second part of it. They put their stamp on it, their signature, and their seal is the thing that would codify it. And so if it has that, we think sometimes the seal, it has had a lot of different ways that it's been implemented over the years, but we think of the wax and the ring or the stamp that puts an impression down that tells you the authority of the person, or that it's being done by the authority of the person that has that signet. So this is what's being done. Now, here's what we have in verse 10 that helps us a little bit further along. Now, those who place their seal on the document. Now, the document is implied here, but we get that from the verse right before, verse 38. So they wrote this out. And so in the writing of it, that's why verse 10 refers to it, or chapter 10, verse 1 refers to it as a document. So they put their seal on the document, and who were they? Well, they were Nehemiah the governor, the son of Hakaliah, the son of Zedekiah. And what we're going to get is a list of all of these names. At verse 8, these were priests. And so then it tells us also who the Levites were that did this. And it says their brethren in verse 10. So verses 8, 9, and 10 gives you the people who are under Nehemiah after that, or the people who were of the prominence. When you think priests, Levites, that helps you to understand who the people are that are being spoken of. You see in verse 10 again the brethren of the priests and the Levites. The leaders of the people is found in verse 14, and then it runs all the way down. I go past those again because the names, some of them are difficult to pronounce, but they're not known to us. So the reason for going through and just citing them doesn't really help us a whole lot. Remember, this list of these names is not written for our benefit. It is a written record of theirs to say, here are the people who, among our brethren, signed and sealed their fidelity to this written document. So it is a historical record that if there's something that they would want to do actionally, in a way of action down the road, they could say, well, wait a minute, you're not holding up to your end of what you committed yourself to, because right here is your signature and your pledge to do these things. Now, there may be people who were very, very careful to do precisely all of these things. Here's a record of saying you pledged at the beginning, and if they look at them later on in life and realize you have been very faithful to your pledge, that's a part of their history and their record that would make a great deal of difference to them, and a great deal of, it shows a willingness to do as God had commanded them to do. So that's why it's more important for their history than for our understanding of it. So with that being said, we get to the part of it where, great, here are the things that in that pledge, it has to also have action. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to say, well, what does it look like when they actually implement it? And that's what we have here in verse 28. So the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Nethinim, and all who had separated themselves from the people of the lands to the law of their God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding. So these are the rest of the people. And it begins kind of in order with the other ones again, the not the leaders, but also people who were involved around the temple. So the singers and the Nethinim, the ones who would serve the priests and the Levites, all the ones who would be in those places of service, those are the ones that are mentioned. But then you notice, and all who had separated themselves from the peoples. So it became even down to the common person, or could have easily become all the way down to the common person. We do know this. Some of the things put in place here would have had to come down to the common person. And if they wanted anything to do with being able to function rightly as a part of the nation, would have to see to doing precisely what we have here in front of us. So with that being said, verse 29 tells us, now these people, they joined with their brethren, their nobles. They entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and to do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his ordinance and his statutes. Now, what that brings into place is pretty much everything that's written as far as the law is concerned. Unlike other times in their history, think about with Joshua, not Joshua, I'm sorry, but of Josiah, King Josiah. There are things that we find when we study through the end of the book of Chronicles, when he's mentioned 34, I think, and 35. When they find the book of the law, there were some things that were going on that were, Josiah, as he understood, was doing what he should have been doing, best as he could understand. But then they found the book of the law and read it in its entirety and realized how far off things were. So it wasn't just, oh, we should change a few things that we're doing. It's not quite what the law said. He was a broken man. This was a man who was actually in a place of kind of terror by saying, when I look at what we're doing as opposed to what God expects of us, and he put in writing, we are going to be judged for this. And so he wants somebody to say, well, not only have we read it, but what's going to happen next? And so they seek out a prophet in that case. So with all of that, our understanding of that, it is one thing to just say that we're going to do that, but then at the same time remembering, yeah, but God wrote this down. And unlike Josiah's time, there's no way that they could plead ignorance because they have it. And they have people who are skilled in understanding it from Ezra downward. So they couldn't plead the kind of ignorance that you may have been able to plead because of the wickedness of the people before you, like Josiah, looking back at Manasseh and the people before him, had done wickedly for so long, for generations actually, that it was hard to even figure out where you came from. The big pieces and whatever may have been handed down by tradition or whatever, but a written copy of the law, was something that they were surprised when they found it. So you don't have the same equivalent here. It's like eyes wide open. We know exactly what God expects of us. Now we need to decide, are we going to do these things? And if so, it's not just some passive, yeah, we'll do it. It's like, okay, sign your name to it, because you're going to be responsible and accountable. And that would be the only reason for taking the oath and having to pledge yourself to it, because, yeah, you're going to be held responsible if you fail. That's a big, big deal. So with all of that being said, here's where we get into kind of the meat of it all. So verse 29, these are the ones who joined. And this idea of a curse and an oath. The oath and the curse would be the things that where they would be able to say, we are going to do this. And if we do not, the curse would be, so may it be that God does X to us for our infidelity. So making an oath, we pledge to do this. And if we fail to do this, then God will do this. And we want to recognize that we would be put in a place of genuine peril if we fail. So that's what the oath would be. And that's, of course, also what the curse would be here, that they called upon themselves. We will do what we're supposed to do according to the law, and if we fail, may God do this to us. You hear those curses and oaths pretty much all throughout the scriptures. So, in particular, this one is at the time when now the walls are built, the temple is up and running. Now, are they going to kind of wing it as seemingly has been done before, or are they going to be very much faithful to the letter of the law? And let's remember, this is their governing document, the law of Moses. So it wasn't an optional thing for them. They were supposed to do precisely as it said, and the penalty would be that they would find themselves in great peril if they went outside of it. All they have to do is take a look around and they realize we're having to rebuild everything because it was destroyed in the first place. And it never could have been destroyed had we been walking with God. But because we abandoned him, we no longer had his protection, and those nations came in and did this to us. So they don't need a reminder of whether or not this is an important thing that they do. It's necessity. So verse 30, this is the first of them. First of the pledges, first of the things that they would not do. We would not give our daughters as wives to the peoples of the land, nor would we take their daughters for our sons. Now, this is reminiscent of what you see in 2 Corinthians 6, where Paul talks about, do we have ourselves be in a place of being unequally yoked with unbelievers? This is the same situation. So we see that something taught as an Old Testament principle, for all of the obvious reasons, people that don't believe as you believe are going to be a corrupting influence on you. That's just the way that it works out. So Paul would say the same thing. What fellowship is there with light and darkness, or with people who would believe in God versus people who would not believe in him, or even worse, believe in foreign gods? There is nothing that they have in common, so let alone that they should have some kind of relationship. This is something that God had told them from the beginning. Do not have any intermarriage with them, because they will corrupt. And we see through their history again and again and again and again that they fell into that trap of having anything to do with the foreign nations and the idolatry that came in as a result of it. Worst offender of probably all of them, Solomon. You find that in his record. Was it 2 Samuel? 2 Samuel. I'd have to go look at it. No, it's not 2 Samuel. It'd have to be 2 Kings, where I think it's by chapter 11. It tells us that his wives turned his heart from the Lord. Let me just make sure. This is one of those passages that, to be honest with you, for whatever reason, I have this total mental block. And it's going to end up being 1 Kings. It's a good thing I looked, right? Yep. So chapter 11 of 1 Kings talks about that King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughters of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and the Hittites, ones they should have never had any dealings with whatsoever. And it says, from the nations whom the Lord said to the children of Israel, that you will not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Sound familiar? What we're reading exactly in Nehemiah. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. He had all these wives and concubines, and they turned his heart from the Lord. We get that in verse 4. For it was so that when Solomon was old, that his wives had turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So, reading just those few verses there helps you to understand exactly why, for two parts. First of all, God said don't do it. But what will be the problem if we infringe on this? Just look back at Solomon. He's probably your best prime example of this. Balaam and Balak and tempting the Moabites to intermarry with the men or to have relationships with them. Another great example of it. But Solomon probably the best of the best when you try to get to it, because it's even said as much there. So we're not to offer our sons or daughters. So you will not give your daughters as wives to the people of the land, nor will you take their daughters for your sons. That's the first one. The second one is this. Now, if the people of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, that we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day, and we would forego the seventh year produce and the exacting of every debt. So things that they were not doing as they should have according to the law. There are two things that are supposed to be done here. The Sabbath day is a day of rest. There's nothing to be done in the commercial sense of your day-to-day life. So I don't care if the people from outside, we can have commercial trade with them, but we don't have marriage with them. However, if those same people that we can have exchange with 6 days a week when it comes to commerce and everything else, on the Sabbath day, there's nothing to be done with them, or anyway, because they're keeping the Sabbath. So there wouldn't even be commerce between the people of Israel, or shouldn't be. Everything would be seen to the day before, in this case Friday, before the sun goes down, because all day until the sun goes down on Saturday, everything would have to be put in place. They would just have no need to do anything on that day other than consecrate it, set it aside for their time with the Lord. That's how it should be. Now, there was also a Sabbath year for the nation. And that would be, if you have crops, if you have everything else, do not do anything with it. Don't tend it, don't plant it, don't do anything. Let the Lord take care of that seventh year. And there was a very practical reason for it. Let the ground replenish itself and let it be fruitful. But more importantly, it's also that idea of giving even the land a rest from you and all of your commercial things, and depend on the Lord for that year. And when they did it in those times, they never had a lack. God always told them, I will take care of you in that seventh year. And you'll be able to glean even after that into the following year what happens naturally without you tending it. I'll take care of those needs. Just trust me in this and make this a time where even the land gets rest from you. That seventh year, all of the debts are canceled, especially in the sabbatical, that 50th year, the Jubilee year, all things reverted back to the primary owners. So you can go back and study on that. Really, really interesting. But they're having to hit, if you will, kind of the reset button here. Everything has to be stopped, and we got to go back to the way that things were. So that was to be done, verse 31. Here's another one. Also, we made ordinances for ourselves to exact from ourselves yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of God, for the showbread, for the regular grain offering, for the regular burnt offering, and for the Sabbaths, for the new moons, for the set feasts, for the holy things, for the sin offering to make atonement for Israel, and all the work of the house of our God. So it would be one thing if the people were bringing their own offerings, but there were some offerings that for the priests and the Levites, and then for the nation would be provided by the support that there was for the temple. And all of that had an expense to it. Plus, when you think about the Levites that were the priests and the Levites, if they were not, well, for sure the priests wouldn't have any kind of a vocation. Levites could have things, but then there were also ones who were in the place of service. And so how is it that they would be able to provide for themselves if their service is full-time to the Lord? Well, they couldn't. So this would be a few different things. Things that are done corporately, the showbread, all of those kind of things, the things that are in the temple, the things that have a monetary need to have funds available to purchase and to procure those things, there would need to be some source of income, since the priests and Levites in that case were not working to bring it in. So the people would support it. And the best way for them to do that initially would be for people to have a contribution that they would have to bring annually. This would be the first time that that had been done. The one that you see mentioned in Exodus was a half, but it was when there was a census that would be taken and then money would be collected, but it wasn't an annual thing. In this case, annual. And so this would be the money that would be brought when people would come, and it would take care of the needs of the temple. Just think of whatever it would take for the temple to operate, for the people who live there, for their provisions, and then for everything that would be done on behalf of the entirety of the people. So again, you might bring an offering, but you're not bringing the wood for that offering. You're not bringing anything for the utensils that are used that would wear out and need to be replaced. So there would have to be a way for all of that to be paid for. This is very similar to what we see, and it's unfortunately become a big thing that people love to argue over, because churches will take, quote, tithe. Tithe just means a tenth part. So I don't think that a church should say you have to pay 10% of everything that you make, and whether people want to argue over is that the gross or the net, it's not biblical that a church should say 10%. Paul lays down a different thing entirely, talks about a cheerful giver. A cheerful giver, if it's of their resources and they have the ability, they may give well in excess of 10%. Whatever God really kind of purposes in their heart to do, that's what they will do. But it is still nonetheless the same thing. If there's a church that meets, the church has obligations. They got to pay the water. They got to pay the electric bill. They got to pay all of those kind of things. So if people are coming to that church and they are partaking of what that church offers, they should have a stake in it. They should help to support that, because it doesn't happen on its own. So I don't have any problem with a church collecting funds from the people who call that church home if there's a benefit to them. And the word is taught, they grow spiritually, it's a place where they can fellowship with other believers, and it's what God intended for the church to be. Great, support that. If God ministers to you through that ministry, support it. Doesn't have to be something grand or anything else between you and the Lord. You support that, because again, if you don't, there's no way that they can keep the doors open. That's an important thing for us to understand. But the idea that it has to be a hard, if you want to call it something else other than a tithe because you're just hung up on the word, fine, do that. But whatever it is that you're going to give as an offering, you're ultimately saying, Lord, out of what you provided for me, I want to give back to you because you've led me to a church that ministers to my heart, my soul, my needs, and it's a place where I can fellowship with like-minded believers. I want to support that. Praise the Lord. That's how it should be. So, with that being said, these various things that in verse 33, there needed to be a supply of funds in order to make those things happen. So verse 34. Then, next thing that they did, we cast lots among the priests and the Levites and the people for bringing the wood offering into the house of our God according to our fathers' houses, at the appointed times year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord, the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. So yeah, when you're doing sacrifices all the time, it requires a tremendous amount of wood to be burned to consume the offerings. So there's not only if they would have to purchase it, it does give that impression that you had a little bit here, but there was also a voluntary gathering up, and they cast lots, so you will know when you're supposed to bring your portion, and you guys know when you're supposed to bring yours. You've got time to prepare and bring it about. Go and collect it and bring it at your appointed time. So the casting of the lots was to make sure that throughout the year, it's not everybody all at once. If it's a 1 year type of a thing, that's not going to be helpful. Bring it year round. Casting lots kind of puts in order who's doing what when. So, in verse 35, another one of these. So we also made ordinances to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all of the fruit of the trees year by year into the house of the Lord, to bring the firstborn of the sons of our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of God. Now let's stop for a moment here. Actually, no, let's read. We'll pick back up. I don't want to go too far with this without addressing it. The importance of the first fruits. Now, this is not only of the things for the people that might have orchards or grain or whatever else it might be. That tenth or that tithe was to be the first of a harvest. If something is coming in, the first time that you start to pick the fruit of it, then that would be offered to the Lord as a first fruits kind of a thing. And you could say, well, God, I don't understand why there's a problem here, because we already know how much we're supposed to give. But in addition to that, at the very beginning of the crops, we're supposed to give that too. Why would that be? And you could say, now, of the livestock, every year you would have the firstborn. So the firstborn male of that particular year, that would be offered to God. When it came to the humans, you don't offer your children. They are to be redeemed back by another offering. So you can read back on that as well. So the idea that there would be the first fruits, which would always be the best of what you had, that was the way it was supposed to be seen. It's the first fruits, it's the increase, it's what God has given to you. Therefore, offer that back to God in a way of thanksgiving, but it's the first fruits, it's the beginning of that particular thing. So it's the first of a kind, if you will. So, well, we had wheat last year. Yeah, but this is the first of your wheat this year. It's the first fruits of this particular annual time. So it was from livestock to even children to your grains and your fruit and everything else. The only thing that would not be offered is a child. And again, as I had already said, they could be redeemed back. So the law made provision for all of those things. Now, you find that there are a number of times when Jesus is referred to in some way or another as being a first fruit. And so you would look at that and say, so how would he fit this type? And this is one of those places that I had mentioned at the beginning where the Old Testament will give you types that when you put Jesus into the equation, it's like, makes perfect sense now. So it would be that thing that would be offered. But think about this. When you think of the person of Jesus, if he is a first fruit kind of an offering, who offered him? And the answer is obvious. He was given to us by God. God gave us his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him, so John 3:16, and a number of other places that you can see where Jesus is referred to as being offered by the Father. Consider he was sent in at Passover. And a Passover lamb had to be examined by the people, that it was spotless, without blemish, that there was nothing wrong with it. It was perfect. And then it could be offered as the Passover offering. Man was the sin that was being judged in Egypt at the time would pass over those people who would offer the lamb as God prescribed. Well, Jesus was examined. He came in at the triumphal entry. Everybody got a chance to see him. He was perfect. There was no blemish in him. He was exactly what was necessary. So you see him offered then at Passover, and so resurrected on that first day of the week. So everything about him, you could say first fruits, offered by God for the sin, and examined, and he was perfect, and then resurrected from the dead. It wasn't a permanent death that took place. And so every type of every type that we read about here, when you consider it as far as being Jesus, it makes perfect sense that he's the fulfillment of all of those things. So here we have that all of those things would have to be offered year by year as the first fruits. With Jesus being offered that once and for all, there was no need for the law any longer, because now everything that was necessary in the past has now been perfectly fulfilled in the person of Jesus, and we look to him as that one-time, once and for all sacrifice, like the book of Hebrews talks about. So here's one of those places where you have a type put into place that they would recognize that would be fulfilled in the person of Jesus as a permanent solution to this. So, first fruits. Now, verse 37, to bring the first fruits of your dough, your offerings, the fruit of all kinds of trees, the new wine and oil, to the priests, to the storerooms of the house of God, and to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites, for the Levites should receive the tithes in all of our farming communities. So, something that would be recognized and necessary. Now, here's a really wonderful thing, and again, I'd love to see this practiced. It should be practiced in every church, And you will find that there are times when the reason for accountability, if accountability reveals something that is being done wrong, then there would be disciplinary action as well. The church has all of that stuff in place. It's written out in the text for us. In this case, This is where you see an accountability type of a thing. And it really is kind of an admission that given enough time and potential, and if that's really of the heart of the person, there can be even people who should know better who will do things that are offensive. And so this is one of those ways of making sure that no accusation could be made, and that there would be no way that anybody could defraud someone else because there were other eyes on it. Look at what they do. And verse 38, the priest, the descendants of Aaron, they will be with the Levites when they receive the tithes. And the Levites will bring up a tenth of the tithes to the house of our God, to the rooms and to the storehouses. For the children of Israel and for the children of Levi will bring the offering of grain, of new wine, and of oil to the storerooms, where their articles of the sanctuary are, where the priests who minister and the gatekeepers and the singers are, and we will not neglect the house of our God. So the idea that there would be priests and Levites together makes it foolproof that there wouldn't be a way where somebody would look at this and say, we have been defrauded, or we haven't been given what is necessary for our well-being, and they would be able to point the finger at someone else. Well, if representatives of the priests and the Levites, remember priests were always Levites, but not every Levite was a priest. Do we understand that? Because if not, remember the priests had to be direct descendants of Aaron. But Aaron was just of the tribe of Levi. So you could be any of those sons of Jacob, Levi. Anybody who was one of his descendants could very easily just be called a Levite. But unless you came through the line of Aaron, anybody after Aaron, Moses' brother, Aaron, they would be the ones who would be the priests. So there was a division within the Levites and the priests. Though they belonged to the same tribe, they had different functions. So in this case, the Levites would be much more numerous. They would be the ones receiving all of the things brought by the people. But as they were received in, a tenth part of all that was received was put aside for the priests, because their full-time job was administering and doing the things of the temple, ministering to the people, doing the offerings, and all the rest of that. So that's their full-time vocation. This was a way that the people could be providing for them, and the rest of it is providing for the rest of the nation of the things being done by the entire temple complex and all the things that were taking place there. So everybody had a stake in this, if you will. And accountability is a very, very important thing. That there would be complete continuity between the priests and the Levites. Never could anybody bring an accusation that was being done was defrauding one group or the other. And so it was just a very careful way of making sure that everything was as it's supposed to be. Now, that brings us to chapter 11. We'll pick it up next week. And we'll just read the first couple of verses. Now, the elders of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one of the 10 to dwell in Jerusalem in the holy city, and 9/10 were to dwell in the other cities. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell in Jerusalem. That is to see to the necessity of the city itself. Because, again, the temple's there, but there's all the other supportive things that go on there. But in our world today, as we think of it, because we can travel such enormous distances in such a short amount of time, other people, because of ancestral things, may have lived well outside of Jerusalem. Think about Jesus in his time. They were living all the way up in Nazareth. And so up in the Galilee area, from his childhood in Nazareth to the time that he was in Galilee, that's a long distance up into the north, and they would have to come back and forth for those feast days that were mandatory for the people to come to. It was quite a bit of moving around. But people would have their reasons for doing the things that they would do, and they were being outside of the city, but some group needed to stay behind. And we'll get into that here because, once again, Nehemiah and the other ones who are overseeing it say there's a necessity for us to take care of the needs of the people who are here now. And this will, chapter 11, start to go into that. So we'll pick up at chapter 11 next week, and we'll get a chance to look through the rest of the book here. And we'll be done here pretty soon, and then getting into the book of Esther. So as we continue on through the Old Testament. If you have any questions on anything that has been shared, then please contact us through the ministry website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And anything that I may have covered, we can go ahead and answer any questions if you have any on them. But we'll pick up at chapter 11 next week.